Hello, Jeff Zwerenk here again with Give and Take, where we look at the latest scientific ideas to help you be more confident in sharing your faith. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Fuz Rana and Ken Samples, and we're going to look at a provocative idea. Are viruses responsible for what we Christians call the image of God? Ken, Fuz, good to have you here today.
Hi,
So
Jeff.
I saw a headline said that an ancient virus may be responsible for human consciousness. So this idea that our ability to be aware of who we are being made in the image of God, that it looks like these viruses are responsible. What do we do with such a headline?
Yeah, well, I saw that article, Jeff, too. And the first thing that I want to point out is that this is a beautiful example of how many times headlines for science in the news articles are extremely provocative and sensationalistic, and many times have actually very little to do with the actual article or the scientific discoveries that the article is based on.
So you're saying to me when I see a provocative headline, I actually need to go look at the article to figure out what's going on?
Yeah, you need to dig a little bit deeper. And part of what's going on here is that writers and editors are trying to get the reader attention so that they are going to read the article. So we want to be careful not to base what we think science is saying on the headlines themselves.
I think that's pretty important. I've found very much the same thing, that the provocative headlines are what they are at some times. So tell me a little bit, okay, so if it's not about explaining consciousness, what is it that the article was dealing with?
Yeah, well, this is actually a really nicely written article that's based on some really nice work done by researchers that were trying to understand the biochemical basis for how neurons form connections with one another.
This is kind of how they communicate with one another, if you will.
Exactly.
Okay.
So whenever information is processed through our brains, the net result is that neurons actually begin to form networks, and they have to connect with one another to form those networks. And it turns out that the biochemical mechanism for how that takes place is very similar to the way in which a retrovirus infection will be transmitted from one cell to the other. So on the basis of that similarity, they conclude that in an animal in the distant past, a retroviral infection was incorporated into the genome of that animal, and then later evolution co-opted that mechanism and then made use of it to help to evolve and sculpt through evolutionary processes the brains of animals and ultimately the brains of humans. So the argument is our ability for conditioning, for learning, for advanced cognitive abilities is ultimately due to this chance retroviral infection.
So that kind of raises a very obvious question. Let's just say all this is true. Does that mean that evolution is correct?
Well, I would say as an old earth creationist, no, because we have to keep in mind people are looking at data from their own particular worldview. So from an evolutionary perspective, that conclusion is reasonable. But from an old earth creationist perspective, I could look at that data and say, well, just because they're similar designs doesn't mean that it means a creator wasn't involved. We use the same designs over and over again in different contexts as human designers, so why wouldn't a creator use the same designs in different ways in the created order?
So when we see these similarities, it doesn't necessarily mean we've got a common ancestor. It could just be a reflection that there's a designer using common designs.
Exactly,
so
yes.
That's very fascinating. So Ken, I would like you to get involved in the discussion here, because this is something that as Christians, this is important, how we're conscious, how we're made in the image of God. How do we think theologically? How do we think well about discoveries like this, assuming that they all play out and are true?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would note is that when you read neuroscientists, when you read philosophers of mind, explaining consciousness is very, very difficult. And candid naturalists will tell you they are pained to try to explain consciousness. Now, from a biblical point of view, human beings are made from the dust of the ground. The dust of the ground, the breath of life is what creates human beings. And so human beings are a reflection, and most Christians would agree with this, that there is a dual nature, that there is the material and the non-material, or the physical and the spiritual. So our consciousness reflects our soulishness, if you will, and there is a union of those two. Human beings are a union of body and soul. That's the basic dualist position, and that is the consensus of historic Christianity.
That doesn't surprise me at all. But I have to say, as I've thought about that in the past, that my inclination was to think, okay, I've got my body, that kind of behaves one way. I've got my spirit, that kind of behaves the other way. It seems like what you're saying is that they're not these two independent things, that they're distinct, but they also influence one another.
Absolutely. And I would say, as Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic philosopher, he said in the intermediate state, which is where we're separate from our body but awaiting the resurrection, that we're not fully human. And I have no doubt that our soul influences our body and our body influences our soul. I think that makes good biblical sense.
So scientifically, how might we expect that to play out if we're a union of body and spirit, that they mutually influence one another? What would we expect to see scientifically?
Well, I think that we shouldn't be surprised to see that there are these brain mechanisms that are responsible for our ability to think in sophisticated ways, that these mechanisms might even explain our emotions, maybe even the attraction that we have for one another. Mm-hmm. But just because, again, we're seeing these physical mechanisms doesn't mean that there's not a spiritual aspect to who we are as human beings. I like to think of it as our brain is like computer hardware and our spirit is like computer software, where they're interacting with one another. But you can't have software without hardware, and you can't have hardware that functions without software.
Well, and it seems to almost be a little bit deeper, that the hardware can influence the software and the software can actually change the hardware too. So it's an even more complex interaction than that. Mm-hmm. So
yeah.
There's often these very provocative headlines that are put out. And while my instinct is to get defensive, what I have learned is that I go read more deeply about the headlines, read the articles. What I often find is that these are topics that people are excited about talking about. And they give me the opportunity to engage in conversations that are already going on and to bring the gospel into those conversations. I'd encourage you to go check out Fuz Rana's YouTube, Facebook Live video. Go to our YouTube channel at Reasons to Believe 1. Look for that video to give you a lot more details and prepare you for those conversations. And look for these provocative headlines so that you can go out and share the gospel.